read that whole thing, eh? I'd be disappointed if you did, Bill.
Whenever you're ready, all you need to do is just flip it up.
Okay.
Here's our Dean of Law School, Darby Dickerson, Corey Goulett.
Thank you for being with us.
Nice to meet you.
And I'll be with you guys at dinner tonight.
All right, well, welcome to our third installment of the Energy Law Lecture Series. As you all know, our first speaker in September was Russell Gold with Wall Street Journal, and our speaker last month was Carlos Ortiz with the Ministry of Energy with the Mexican government. And today we are very honored and privileged to have with us a representative from our neighbor to the north. Corey Goulett is with TransCanada, and he is the president of Keystone Projects, which includes the Keystone XL pipeline, which will be the topic of his address today. Corey has overall accountability for the development and implementation of all phases of the Keystone pipeline, including securing land and permits, engineering, procurement, construction, commissioning, startup, and testing. And I had the opportunity to work with Corey on the project a couple of years ago and got to know him then. And he very graciously agreed to come spend the day with us today. We'll not only be here for this hour, but he was with me my legislative process class just now, and he'll be speaking at my oil and gas class later this afternoon, and then he'll spend some time over at the business school with some folks over there, as well as the petroleum engineering department. So we're just really pleased to have him here. And Corey, you might know, I think you probably do, and y'all out there might know that the U.S. Senate just took a vote on the Keystone XL pipeline last night. And that resulted in that story being the front page headline of the Wall Street Journal today, as well as on the front page of the Daily Toreador here on campus. So I just want you to know how much coordination that required for me to make all that come together for you in anticipation for your of your speech today. So anyway, just want you to know how much stroke Texas Tech Law School has in this topic, and would like all of us to help me welcome Corey Goulett.
Thanks very much, Bill. Can you hear me all well? Yeah, good. I see that there's members of the legislative class here, so we spent I don't know, maybe 45 minutes talking, and I'm sure they'll point out when I'm saying something that was a little bit different from what I told them. I was in South Dakota and Nebraska last week, and with this cold snap hitting the lower 48, everyone was complaining to me that I brought the cold weather. It's actually warmer in Calgary than it is most of the United States today, so it didn't come from me. And this isn't Canadian weather, it's Alaska weather. In fact, I was on watching the news this morning, and they were saying that all 50 states fell below 32 degrees somewhere in the state today. Or yesterday, I should say. So that doesn't happen very often. I guess I woke up this morning and I got the usual bill under my door, and I also got this note, and it says, "Good morning. I hope everything with your stay went smoothly." And we've all got notes like this. "It was a pleasure to meet you." And I was thinking, oh, that must be the person at the front desk. I got in about 11 o'clock. "I know that you have an early flight, so please, I wanted to start your day with a little better than it ended. Have a great day." And I was thinking to myself, a little better than it ended. Exactly what did she have in mind? Well, I thought back to our conversation, and she asked me how I was doing, and I said, oh, I'm a little tired. I was up at 5:30 this morning, and I just came off a 4-hour flight. But other than that, I hadn't mentioned Keystone XL. So either she figured out who I was, because I do stay there fairly frequently, or she was just showing some compassion for the rates you have to pay at the Marriott at the International Airport. One or the other. As Bill mentioned, you know, we did have another vote, or actually, we've had many votes in the House, but the Majority Leader, Reid, has been preventing votes at the Senate level for a few years now. And we did have a historic vote there yesterday at about 6:15 Eastern, and unfortunately came one vote short. Now I do think, and I'm sure I'll get a few questions on this, I do think that it would have been vetoed anyway. The President was foreshadowing the fact that he was probably leaning in that direction anyway. So thanks again for having me here today, and good afternoon. I think we've all heard about Keystone XL. Who hasn't heard about Keystone XL? Yeah, it's a pretty well-known topic. Who thinks it should be approved? Who thinks it shouldn't be approved? Come on, 20 to 30% of the population out there thinks it shouldn't be approved, so there must be some people who don't think it should be approved. Well, maybe in Texas you guys understand the need for energy, so maybe it's a little different. Well, hopefully I'll address some misconceptions that are out there today. And when I ask that question with audiences where I do presentations, often I'll jot down all of the reasons why they say we shouldn't approve the project, and then address them throughout the speech. But if you've heard a few of them throughout, save your questions for the end, and I'll address the ones that I haven't talked about. So it was no big deal building linear infrastructure 10 or 20 years ago, and we have over 2 million miles of pipelines in North America, and there remains many obstacles for Keystone XL, but TransCanada remains committed to the project. And I'll talk a little bit about it in more detail. So I have some forward-looking information. The lawyers or future lawyers in the room will appreciate this slide. My remarks include forward-looking statements that are subject to risks and uncertainties. And if you don't believe that, you haven't been following Keystone XL for the last 2,200 days. Anyway, there's reports that are provided by us to the Canadian Securities Regulatory Commission, as well as the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, if you want more details. In other words, don't rely on my comments. So I'll start with a very quick overview of TransCanada, and I know we want to keep the lecture part of this, or the presentation part of this, to a half hour or so I won't spend a lot of time. But Keystone XL is a small part of what we do at TransCanada. We're one of North America's largest natural gas pipeline networks. We provide energy to millions of people so that they can heat their homes and cook their meals, and in the case of oil pipelines, drive their cars. We're the third largest natural gas storage operator in North America, with a lot of storage in Michigan, actually, as you can see on the map. We're the largest private sector power generator in Canada, with almost 11,000 megawatts of power production. And I spent about a decade of my career building power plants, and I'll talk a little bit about it in another slide, around Canada and the New England area of the United States. And we've become a significant player in the oil pipeline business in the last 6 or so years. And it started with the 2010 startup of our base Keystone system that's transported almost 700 million barrels, or $70 billion worth of crude oil already. We have 5,500 employees, total assets of $48 billion, and we operate in 7 provinces, 33 states, and 5 Mexican states. So what are we going to be in the future? Well, that $48 billion of asset is the foundation for us to capture new opportunities in North America. And our focus certainly is North America. We have $38 billion of commercially secured projects. In other words, projects where our customers, our shippers, have signed up for capacity and take-or-pay transportation agreements. And now, all we have to do, and I say this quickly, is get them permitted. So, looking forward, you can see we intend to grow from a 50 billion or so project to an 80 billion or larger company. I mentioned our energy projects because one of the criticisms that's leveled at TransCanada is that all we care about is oil and gas and those nasty fossil fuels. But we've spent $5 billion on renewable energy and emissionless energy. And here are a few examples. We built the largest wind farm in New England, in Maine on Kibbe Mountain. We have 9 solar facilities in eastern Canada, some 86 megawatts. We have 13 hydro facilities in New England. And finally, and last but not least, we operate or are an owner, a part owner, about a 40% in interest in the largest power plant in the world, Bruce Nuclear, that has 6,300 megawatts of capacity over 8 reactors, and it sits right across from Michigan on Lake Huron. So we currently have, we understand that there has to be solutions for a less carbon-intensive future, and we've invested significantly in them. But we also understand the pros and cons of those technologies and those opportunities as well. A little background as far as Keystone XL was concerned and why it was conceived in the first place. This map, each of these pie charts shows the refining capacity, and the size of the pie is indicative of the size of the refining capacity in each of those markets across North America. The red represents the amount of Western Canadian crude that currently meets the demands of refining in each of the areas. And the green represents the imports that are coming outside of North America. And so you can see that the largest opportunities in the U.S. Gulf Coast area, not only because there's some 7.5 million barrels a day of capacity, refining capacity in that particular area, but also because most of that capacity is being served, some almost 5 million barrels a day is being served by imports from outside of North America. And so if you were to look at our business plan 6 years ago, you would have seen a map similar to this. I think this is from 2012. But you would have seen a map similar to this, and you would have seen why our customers were asking us to build a pipeline from growing production in Western Canada and the Bakken down to the Gulf Coast area so that we could displace crudes that were being imported from Venezuela, from the Middle East, from Nigeria. And that really was the impetus behind the Keystone series of projects. Some people are surprised to discover that North America needs to invest more in energy infrastructure than any other continent or jurisdiction in the world. And this is from the International Energy Agency, and it predicts the trillions of dollars that will be spent over the next 20 or 30 years in various sectors of the infrastructure environment. And you can see in that bottom bar that North America needs to invest some $6 trillion in energy infrastructure, and $2.5 trillion of that is associated with oil. And one might ask, why aren't developing areas of the world needing to spend more? Well, I think there's two things that force us to spend money on infrastructure. The first is that our infrastructure is aging and it has to be replaced. And the second is that it's a changing environment out there. Shale gas has changed where gas is produced and relative to the markets where it's consumed. Tight oil has changed where oil is produced relative to where it's needed, where the refining capacity is. And many other aspects of the business are changing in North America. And so this provides a great opportunity for companies like TransCanada to invest in this industry. To put it in perspective, we're going to need about $94 billion a year between 2014 and 2025. That's equivalent to the entire telecommunications industry in North America. Now we'll talk a little bit about Keystone Projects. As I mentioned, the base Keystone started in 2010. We expanded that in 2011 when we built the Cushing extension. And then just earlier this year, we completed the Gulf Coast project, the 485-mile pipeline from Cushing, Oklahoma down to Nederland, Texas, that allowed us now to bring crude not only to the Wood River Patoka area and Cushing, but all the way down to the Gulf Coast. And as I mentioned earlier, in that time, we've shipped almost 70 million barrels of crude on that system. We're just finishing up the Houston lateral. In fact, the pipeline has already been completed, and we're working on the tank terminal, which is in East Houston, a little place called Moore Junction, and that will be completed mid next year as well. Relative to Keystone XL, it's some 1,200 miles that goes from where we call Hardisty, Alberta, to Steel City, Nebraska, in southern Nebraska. We extracted the Gulf Coast project from the original Keystone XL pipeline and built it as a separate project. And ironically, 2.5 years ago or so, President Obama sat in front of a bunch of pipe in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and said, "This is a great thing to do." I wish he'd do the same thing in front of a pile of pipe in Gascoyne, North Dakota. We put our last presidential permit application in May 2012, and we've put a number in as the project's changed. And we got our Nebraska approval for our new route around the Sandhills, and you can see that kind of jog in Keystone XL in Nebraska. That jog was put in place in 2012 to avoid the Sandhills, which were considered by many in Nebraska to be kind of equivalent to their national park. And so we made a commitment with the state to reroute around them. The project's now pegged at about $8 billion. And by the way, the original estimate was $5.4 billion, which just goes to show what delaying a project can cost you. And we've also added an on-ramp in Baker, Montana, and you can see it highlighted there, where we can inject about 100,000 barrels a day of light crude from the Bakken area and in batches and transport it to any one of the 3 markets that I mentioned earlier. Currently, I guess we still have on this that we could be in service in 2016, but realistically, if we got approval next year, and we'll talk a little more about that and what might happen as a result of the midterm elections, it might be 2017 before we could be in service if things advance next year. Today the U.S. consumes some 15 million barrels a day and imports 6 to 7 million barrels a day. And most people don't realize that, how much oil that we use day in, day out in the U.S. To put that in perspective, about half of that oil is used in transportation, cars and trucks. But the other half is used in manufacturing of various goods and services that we all use day in, day out. About 1 million barrels a day is used just flying around the U.S. And, people will talk about alternatives, but I think it'll be a long time before we get a solar-powered plane that will be effective at transporting large quantities of people. So that gives you an idea of the market today. And the second bullet describes what the forecast is, which is that the U.S. will continue to import some 7.5 million barrels a day into 2035, which gets back to my original question, where would you rather have that come from? And currently, Canada produces about 3 million barrels per day, and we're forecast to double that over the next 25 years or so as well. The oil sands are the only growing source of supply that's land-based and connected to the U.S. market beyond the obvious Bakken, Niobrara, Permian Basin, and Eagle Ford plays that are within the U.S. But those 4 plays I mentioned won't meet the goal of energy self-sufficiency or independence anytime soon, if ever. And I think, even when the President speaks, and just last week he talked about the fact that we've almost got to the point where we're producing almost as much as we're importing. Well, that's only half. And so to say that in the same breath as energy independence for the U.S. is probably a little bit naive. Energy independence for North America, it's possible. But it will take some vision by leadership and the industry to make it happen. I promised I'd show this at that legislative class, and this is the slide that shows or demonstrates why Keystone XL has become such a big deal. And so we'll start with a little bit of background in that regard. This breaks down the world's oil reserves by country. And you can see that Canada has the third most oil reserves with 173 billion barrels. And a lot of that in the oil sands. You can see about 56% in the oil sands. The oil sands remains the largest basin that is open to private sector development in the world. And that's why U.S. multinationals are investing in the oil sands, and others are investing in the oil sands. All of the other top 10 countries, the oil infrastructure, the oil producing industry is mostly nationalized. So when you think about that, and I'll talk in a few slides about it, but just take time to reflect. If you were someone who is fundamentally and philosophically opposed to fossil fuels, where would you spend your time? You'd spend your time in the oil sands in Canada. You wouldn't spend it in those other 9 countries. because those other 9 countries aren't going to listen to you. So we get a lot of criticism that the oil sands will contribute to greenhouse gases. The right pie shows that Canada represents about 2% of the total greenhouse gas emitted in the world, with the U.S. being about 18%. And it kind of makes sense. Our population is about 10% of what the U.S. population is, right? And most greenhouse gases really come down to our own personal consumption, whether it be of products or fossil fuels to power vehicles or provide energy. The oil sands then represents about 7% of Canada's emissions by sector. And the final supplemental environmental impact statement, I have a slide that describes its conclusions in more detail, but they indicated that there'd be no significant increase in greenhouse gases as a result of the Keystone XL pipeline. And that only represents 1/7 of 1% of all the greenhouse gas emissions on Earth. It comes from the oil sands sector. And even if that were to double, which we're hoping we can expand that business, as I mentioned earlier, in the next 25 years, that would only represent, one-third or 1/4 of 1% of all the greenhouse gases. And yet you'll hear people, Bill McKibben of 350.org, describing the oil sands as the largest carbon bomb on Earth. But does that look like the biggest impact or the largest bomb relative to greenhouse gases and the carbon-intensive nature of our society today? Hardly. Environmental issues it's not something new that we've had to deal with. The industry has been dealing with people who've questioned the environmental impact associated with energy infrastructure for many, many decades. But for us, it really came to a head in 2010 as a result of 3 incidents. And they increased the amount of fear and concern that the public had relative to pipelines. The first was the Deepwater Horizon spill here in the Gulf, which many, being from Texas, you've all lived it. The second was the Enbridge's Kalamazoo spill in Michigan, and the third was the San Bruno explosion in a subdivision in California. And obviously all of those had a huge impact in terms of fatalities, but they also had a huge impact on the environment. And the battle that we're currently waging is one of public perception. And the misinformation that our opponents use constantly to try to prevent oil sands, and more specifically, the link that the oil sands has to the market, Keystone XL, from happening. Keystone XL might be the most scrutinized project in North American history. I used to say that probably Alyeska, and some of us, Bill, I think you probably were around when we were talking a lot about Alyeska, but the fact that it was in Alaska and a little bit further removed probably didn't get it to the level that Keystone XL is at right now. But the most important thing for us is to provide access to facts about the project in terms of safety, integrity, and the role of energy in our day-to-day lives. I was at an editorial board in Pierre, South Dakota last year. And it was in response to an editorial that they had written, and they said, "We just can't find any information about this project." TransCanada's not providing enough information. It was like, oh, well, I'm not sure that they knew how to use Google because there's a tremendous amount of information if you want to go look for it. And not just information provided by us, information provided by each of the states that we cross, information from the State Department, and of course information by our opponents. You know, social media has become a critical tool for our opponents. They're able to provide their messages to a wider audience, but probably more importantly to them, and they probably wouldn't admit this, they have no factual accountability that they need to consider. If you continuously lie or provide false information, it's amazing how often that ends up being perceived as the truth. And just this morning we talked about some of the misinformation that's out there. One of which is all this oil is going to be exported. It's all destined for China. And there couldn't be anything further from the truth, first of all. And secondly, that's completely within the federal government's control. They're the ones who control the permits for export. If they don't want the oil to go to China, don't give any export permits. And currently today, there aren't that many export permits. Very, very few. And in fact, most of the export permits are to export oil to our refineries in Canada on the East Coast. And yet, that is the probably number one or number two question I get when I go around is, I hear the oil's going all to China and to export. And it's just an example of a complete lie and misinformation that has been repeated as far as the President of the United States. Today we have dedicated teams that are monitoring and tracking social media continuously. And we determine on a daily basis how we're going to engage and the level of response we're going to provide to all forms of social media out there. I didn't realize how Google made money until I got involved in this project. And we spend literally hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in auctions getting the right for our web page to come up first when someone chooses keywords like Keystone or Keystone XL or oil pipelines. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, because our goal is to get the facts out there. And the only way of doing that is making sure people get onto our web page, and the best way of doing that is having it come up first when you do a search. And that's how Google makes money. And that's why they're the biggest company, and I think they're bigger than Exxon now in terms of sheer size. The base Keystone project took 23 months to complete. We're at 74 months and counting on Keystone XL. We've had over 90 open houses, and we've had 5 environmental impact statements produced by the State Department, some 17,000 pages of documents, obviously only a portion of which are shown in this photo. In the last hearing and national interest determination period that lasted actually only 60 days because it was put on hold pending the Nebraska Supreme Court decision, 1.5 million comments were received as part of that process. And TransCanada actually pays for a third-party contractor directed by the federal government to review every one of those 1.5 million comments and categorize it and provide provide a summary report to the State Department. We've spent over $400 million on the regulatory process associated with this project. Our budget was about $50 million. And while that only represents 5% of the project, imagine if that's repeated over and over and over again for every energy infrastructure project that will provide energy to all of us. That's 5% of waste. Why couldn't we have made a decision on this the first time and not the 5th time or the 6th time? And we'll end up all paying for it in terms of higher energy costs. It'll all flow down to the bottom line eventually. And yes, we need a rigorous and thorough review process. That's an absolute requirement of any large infrastructure project that we do in our society. But we also have to make it reasonable, and we also have to leave the politics out of that review. And that's where we're stuck today. I promised a quick slide on the final supplemental environmental impact statement that was released earlier this year. You can see the conclusions here that it will have minimal impact on the environment, that it won't change the rate of the oil sands extraction or development, that the project supports some 42,000 direct, indirect, and induced jobs, that the project will contribute $3.4 billion of U.S. GDP during its construction and an additional $295 billion to the U.S. GDP during its 20-year operation. And then finally, Keystone XL will have a degree of safety higher than that of a typically constructed oil pipeline system because of the 59 special conditions that we've agreed to. And we agreed to them because we felt it was the only way to get the project approved. But those conditions probably add another 10 to 15% to the cost of the project. So why does the President repeat the misinformation and not approve the project? We'll talk about that again a few slides from now. Just a quick update on Nebraska. A lower court ruled that the Public Service Commission, rather than the governor, should approve the alternate route for Keystone XL, even though a law was passed to give the governor that right. And immediately after that lower court ruled, appeal was filed by the Attorney General. And we've gone through the written arguments, provided the written arguments. The oral arguments were provided in September, and we're waiting for a Supreme Court decision, and we expect it any week, perhaps month. But I'd be surprised that we don't get it by that decision by the end of the year. You know, we respect and follow all state and federal regulatory processes, and if we don't get a positive decision from our perspective, we'll use the Public Service Commission process to get the project approved in Nebraska as well. And we continue to believe that the Keystone XL project and the benefits it provides to Americans. And our shippers and refiners are 100% behind the project as well. I hadn't mentioned that, but we've extended our contracts with the shippers a couple times, and they continue to need to have an alternative. They're shipping more and more crude by rail, hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. It's more costly, in some cases up to twice the amount to ship it by rail. It's not as safe, and it results in higher greenhouse gases. And finally, it's less efficient. And there's a reason why pipelines have become the go-to technology for shipping oil and gas. South Dakota PUC is a recent development. You'll hear people make a bigger deal out of this than it probably should be. But basically what happened is 10 years ago we got a permit granted by South Dakota. And now, according to their rules, if you haven't started construction within 4 years, you're required to demonstrate that the conditions for the project still exist or haven't changed. And our argument would be that the conditions are even stronger than they were 4 years ago. But there'll be a whole process we'll have to go through over the coming months to demonstrate that, including maybe even a hearing. We'll find out more in November 25th when the PUC in South Dakota next meets. But there's, some of the conditions that have improved is that we brought on the the Bakken market link, or the 100,000 barrels a day since this project was originally approved. We've got 100% of the easements in South Dakota. At the time, we hadn't even started land acquisition. We've added the 59 conditions I mentioned since this project was approved. And finally, 4 years ago, the amount of rail that was being used was relatively low. And now, the amount of rail used is significantly more. And this project will benefit South Dakotans by removing the backlog that they have across their state in moving agricultural products to market. It's been 6 years, 2,200 days that we've been in this fight for approval of the project, and activists are determined to block this project for seemingly symbolic reasons. Because if you look at the facts, this isn't the carbon bomb that they pretend it is, and this is no different than the 10,000 miles of pipelines, crude oil pipelines, that have been built in America since 2008. It happens to cross the border. That's the only difference. This slide just shows why we, TransCanada, and our industry won't go away. The amount of Western Canadian and U.S. Bakken production is forecast to far exceed the takeaway capacity. And the need is too great and the cost is too high to transport crude oil by another means. And to the Canadian economy, and I talked about the implications to the U.S. economy, but to the Canadian economy, the oil sands represents $2.1 trillion. So relative to the interferences in this project, it manifests itself in three different ways. It's increased the regulatory permitting timelines and the costs, and I mentioned that already. And it's resulted in a lack of a deadline for action to be taken, and it's increased the risk of the project. So how have we responded? Well, I got a great question in the legislative class about, who are you dealing with? Do you worry about Washington? Or I'm paraphrasing now, but where do you focus your energies from a public legislative perspective? And we focus it at the grassroots, at the landowner. There are partners in infrastructure projects, in the counties, at the state, and finally nationally. And it's important for us to do all of those things. And the playing field is completely changed and will be changed forevermore when it comes to energy infrastructure projects as a result of Keystone XL and the debate that we've had. It's emboldened our opponents to believe that they can actually prevent projects from happening. And they might be able to, but some projects, but you can't change the economics and the fact that the U.S. will continue to need 15 million barrels a day of crude oil in the foreseeable future. So some of the tactics that we're using now is to engage early, to educate the public, to spend more time on media campaigns, to spend more time in schools, to spend more time in front of groups like this, to educate them about the project and the energy industry in general, to listen to people, to hear what their concerns are, to build relationships, and as important as anything, to create local benefits so that this project doesn't benefit the person who's filling their gas tank, but it benefits the landowner, and it benefits the community, and it benefits the county where the infrastructure actually has to be built. And we do that through collaboration, trust, integrity, and responsibility. Those are our TransCanada core values. The social climate has changed, perhaps forever, but we're confident that somehow we can find a way to successfully build this project through the partnerships we've created and the bipartisan support that we have from legislators at the state and federal level. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
We've got about 5 minutes for questions, and I'll repeat the question so the people watching on the internet and also on the recording can know what the question was. So any questions for Mr. Goulett before we adjourn here in a couple of minutes? Yes, sir.
Is there a point where you just throw your hands up and say it's not worth it anymore? I mean, at this point, it seems like you're looking at these years before you actually get a permit.
The question is there a point, do you come to a point when it just becomes not worth it anymore?
Yeah, I guess a couple comments on that question. The first is, I think there is a real opportunity with a Republican-led Senate and House in the next legislation to get this project approved. And if it's approved, and we expect a Nebraska Supreme Court decision very, very soon this year, and we don't expect the South Dakota PUC recertification process to take that long, I think we could get all the permits necessary next year. And so maybe it's not 2 years. Maybe it is if we can't get through the federal approval process next year, but the rules will have changed, or the situation has changed in Washington. And this may be attached to must-pass legislation. I mean, that'll be one of the tactics the Republicans will probably use next year, early next year, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. That's the first part of the answer. The second one is, our shippers are fully behind us, and you saw the slide that showed the Bakken and Canadian production, oil sands production, and what's happening over time. And the alternatives for them are costly. And so they continue to support the project, and if we have to wait till a new administration in 2 years, we'll do that. Whether it's Republican or Democratic, we expect it to be more supportive of infrastructure like this than the current administration is. Yeah.
One more question? Yes, sir.
How much of a correlation is there between the U.S. expanding constraint on U.S. oil exports with the approval of the pipeline? From everything I read, it just started allowing light crude oil exports, and I feel like if they allowed that, that would create more opportunity to bring in the heavy crude oil from Canada, which would make sense and ultimately result in a lower gas price for citizens. I'm just curious if y'all are relying on us expanding on exports.
We're certainly not.
Let me just quickly. The question is there a connection between the movement to lift the crude oil export ban currently in effect in the United States and the Keystone XL pipeline bringing crude oil to the United States?
Yeah, there's no connection really. I mean, as long as you continue to need 7.5 million barrels of imports into the U.S., this project wasn't predicated on any increase in export permits whatsoever. It was completely predicated that you have 5 million barrels a day of imports of heavy oil into the U.S. Gulf Coast, and we can meet that, or a portion of that, from Canada, period, right? So that was the impetus of the project in the first place. And, you know, people ask me all the time, will this project result in lower gas prices? It is so complicated. It's such a geopolitically infused discussion about what drives oil prices around the world that it's impossible to say one project will have an effect on that or not. But what I can tell you is that the laws of economics, and I'm no economist, but the more supply you have, the better infrastructure you have, and the more options people have to sell their crude, right? Generally, the lower the prices will be. So projects like Keystone XL and higher producing in the Bakken and the other basins around North America will allow oil prices to stay low over time.
If you have a minute, come on down front and ask Corey a question of your own. But in the meantime, help me thank Corey Goulett.
Thanks. Sorry it took a little longer.
Well, that's okay. I knew it was going to be tough. But,
Yeah.
the 50-minute thing is tough in the class. I know how tough it must be on a presentation like this.
Yeah.
So we'll see if people come down, but we'll use the next few minutes to eat lunch, get a quick bite, and then head over to the business center.
Yep, that was great.